So what's compliance look like? I always like looking at some good examples, especially from the open source world, because this is the culture, the open source culture kind of telegraphing what they expect. So I like looking at Linux. I like looking at things like Firefox and the open source browsers. What's nice about like Firefox is they're an open source organization, but they also have paid lawyers. They have the culture around it. And so they do, I think, a really good job. They have the about box. They have the licensing information that's very public there, and they show the information about the licensing. So if you have something like this, you're probably doing a pretty good job. If you don't have something like this, I always like pointing people to good examples in the open source world because you can use that as a model. Okay. Source bundles. Again, this is I think this is the Mozilla example as well. How do they release source bundles? And I think if you're in certain organizations where you're delivering mobile apps, you're delivering containers, you're delivering virtual machines or devices in the automotive and the kind of IoT space, delivering the source bundles is very important. I think this is a place where people get the most heat and light and anger from the open source community, is they say, you're supposed to be delivering this and you haven't done it. And people have to jump through hoops. And there's been a couple things around the automotive world where people have complained about, I didn't get the right thing, and they've made a blog entry that's then exploded into 50 articles. You really don't want to be in that place. So if you have the obligation to be passing on source, it's important to work with your engineering team to say, how do we get this source, put it into a bundle without mixing our commercial code in with it, unless we have to, and then getting it so that it's very easy and very transparent for our users to get it. If it's too hard, you're going to have people get confused about whether you're actually complying or not. And if it's too difficult for you to kind of get this done ahead of time, you're going to spend a lot of time after the fact. Somebody 3 years, 5 years, 10 years later and says, I expect the source. And these open source projects may not even be around anymore. You might have to be using like the Wayback Machine or the Internet Archive to even try to get close to it. And it's best to try to capture these things at component selection time and use time, save them away, so that it becomes like breathing in order to comply with these obligations. And especially if you're dealing with anything with GPL, anything with Linux, this should be on top of your mind, because this is one of the biggest things that people want to see, especially the authors. Okay. Some common misunderstandings. So if we're going to be using MIT code, we're going to be using Apache code, it's pretty straightforward. We use what we use, we comply with this. The things that seem to cause the biggest legal and engineering fights seem to be some of the code that is not quite open source. So it's out there on the internet, it's visible code, but it doesn't have an open source license associated with it, or we're not quite sure if it has a license. So just because the code is available doesn't mean we have permission to use it. And this is some of the biggest battles I'll see with engineering, is saying, we've already used it. I got it off a forum. What do you want me to do, rewrite it? And so this is where I think education really can help. So the developer should understand that if they don't see a license or they don't get a license for that code, don't even put it in the code base. Because we're going to, we have 25 lines of source code that's going to cause 25 email exchanges just to get a license for this or to rewrite it. We see the terms public domain used way too much in places where it's not actually public domain. So if you hear people say public domain, I always want to explicitly understand, why are you saying that? What do you mean by this? Because it's sometimes used as a magic totem, a magic word to say, oh, it's public domain. We can do anything we want with it. And then you'll look at it, it's actually under the general public license. It's really important to get the license terms correct. And there's certain hot button terms. When I see public domain, when I see freely available, when I see free code, I go, yeah, free. I go, oh, I better go check on this. SAS versus internal use, I'll talk about this in a little bit. But if I'm shipping code, I have a lot more obligations under the open source licenses than if I'm doing a SAS site. But I'll talk about that. But that changes very quickly when we start doing containers or private clouds and things like that. And
what defines a rewrite?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's a $1,000 question. I see. I call a lot of the rewrites I see. People say, "Oh, I did clean room development." It's really dirty room development. They're looking over here and they're typing a fix over here. When people have GPL violations, when they have other license violations, and developers come back in a day and said, "Oh, I rewrote it," I'm very suspicious of that. So it's very important to give explicit instructions on rewriting. And it depends on what type of industry you're in and how important that code is. But in general, I like to very explicitly explain to them, I don't want you just stripping copyrights and changing variable names. If it's important enough to rewrite, go have somebody who didn't have exposure to the code, tell them what the API should be, and then have them rewrite it. But it's also, we have to be pragmatic. If it's 15 lines of code, how much clean room development are we going to do, et cetera? And that starts to become a legal discussion. But this also is about fixing things after the fact. We have all these problems sometimes because people picked things that didn't have good licenses, or they changed the license and now we have to refactor it. It's always better to do it right the first time, but you will find that you have a significant amount of technical debt and things that have to be fixed because they came in 10 years ago, and you find them and you say, now, it's GPL, it's 15 lines of code, how do we rewrite it? Try to set up some really clear expectations. And then the commercially licensed code, people say, oh, it's commercial, it can't have any open source in it, or they would have told us. And this is where we'll talk about the supply chain a little bit. This is one of the biggest concerns I have around vulnerabilities in open source and disclosures is we get code that comes in from another company. It could be all open source, especially less in financial world, but even here, we saw a lot of the presentations over the last couple of days here, people saying, I'm a big commercial company, here's my open source project. So it might have a commercial company's name behind it, but actually has an open source license. Maybe it's Apache 2.0 for the FINOS world here, but in other places, automotive, GPL is the culture there. So I see a lot of people saying, oh, it came from this company, this automotive company, and we go look at it. It's all GPL. It's not commercial. We actually have some very strong obligations there. So another good thing to train your developers to always ask for the license and ask that follow-up question of, is there open source here? Are there additional terms that I have to pay attention to?
Sorry.
Yes?
I think training is key here. As an IT company, the thing I tell my developers is that your starting point should be that somebody who wrote the code has the right to do with it what they want, and that's the fundamental basics of what you need to respect. So that training element, rather than trying to fix after something has happened, after somebody has copied the code, is very crucial.
Yes, yes. And do it right the first time if you can, but also understand that we've been using open source for 20 years. And it hasn't always been done the right time, so we have that technical debt. So get clean, stay clean is kind of the philosophy that I like. One thing I like to always add at this point, too, is around kind of how we modify code. So we bring in code from the outside world, and sometimes we do things that are the right technical choice, but they cause legal and open source compliance problems. So especially in the financial services world, there's a lot of JavaScript being used. And it's going to be used in the web front end. It's going to be used for our UI. And developers and IT people are going to say, let's minimize it, which basically means we take this, it's a little bit like compilation, but a little different. Take this big JavaScript library for our web browser and shrink it down so it's faster. So it costs us less to deliver, the experience is faster. Maybe we get a little obfuscation and kind of hide some of our IP behind there. But we're doing this to the open source libraries that may not allow it. Or we're emphasizing this and not putting in the right copyrights and things like this. So just another thing is you're building your policies around the use of JavaScript. Be mindful of, we have licensing obligations, and then we have kind of technical requirements for fast and cheap downloads. And they sometimes are going to be at odds with each other. And this might be a case where IT and engineering and legal need to come up with some really good policies around what do we do with this open source, and how do we deliver it, and how do we modify it to make it work. The other thing I see is people only have the minified versions. So 5 years later, they don't know what's really going on. They don't know what version of the code is being used. They don't know how they've modified it. They don't know if somebody's hacked it behind the scenes. And we're starting to see more and more supply chain attacks in JavaScript. So if you don't have the original source that you can do a code review and a license review of, you're in trouble. So my best practice on this is always preserve the original code. Even if you end up doing some sort of transformation or minification on it, always try to work from the original code, do that minification as part of the build, so that you're kind of dealing with the original IP and original files, not with some magic JavaScript that's being passed on from generation to generation. Okay, so the other important thing is understand how you're delivering your code. So the cultural impact of, are we a SaaS company? Are we a classic distribution company? Do we have mobile apps? Are we a company that builds classic applications that we then give to, there's a terminal, financial services terminal in all of our clients that is running our code? That's a distribution. Are we now putting out Docker? Are we putting out containers? This is a really big change. 5 years ago, everybody says, oh, we're all software as a service world. We don't have to think about licensing anymore and license compliance. And as I said before, I think we're shipping more Linux and more open source now in containers than we shipped virtual machines or physical devices 5-10 years ago. So it's important to understand this. And it's also important for your developers to understand why you're doing this and that they don't overlook things. It's very common people to say, oh, we're a SaaS app. Oh, well, except we have a mobile app for Android and Windows phone and iPhone. Well, let's go look at that code. What's going on there? The case I say is, oh, we've never shipped our code to anybody. We're SaaS. And then somebody on the engineering call will raise their hand and say, oh, except for so-and-so. We made them a private cloud version. And they took all the code that they thought was never going to be distributed, including all this GPL and other things that they then passed to their biggest client and biggest customer in a private cloud or a private on-premises version. So it's important to understand that and also understand that your business model can change overnight, especially when you have a large customer or a large client who's going to say, our data never leaves our network, therefore you better put it here. The other thing I think is still being decided on, is still being argued about, is what about things like cloud providers like Amazon or Azure? Hey, I have my private cloud version here, can you run it there? So it's running on Amazon and it's being paid for by a client. Is that a distribution? My traditional view would be yes, that probably should be seen as a distribution. We should be paying attention that way. Some people will argue about that. I think it's important to understand and surface those issues and then have your legal team kind of figure it out.
It's a very interesting problem. The hyperscalers are starting to pull together contracts with the telcos, and they're setting up instances in the telephone exchanges. They're converting the telephone exchanges into cloud services to the hyperscalers. So when you need proximity to the user, you set up, the hyperscaler will set up an instance in a telephone exchange 4 kilometers away from the user.
Yep.
And that's all going to get very confusing.
Yeah.
That's happening now in Spain.
The technical solution sometimes is at odds with what we think is the compliance side. I also like drawing these slides. When I go work with my engineering teams, when I go work with my clients, I like drawing. I'm a very whiteboard-oriented person. Say, let's draw out the architecture here. So let's go from bare metal to the firmware, to the operating system, to the client things, to where our app leaves. And are there probably multiple versions of this box? Oh, we got our license system over here. We have our database over here. We have this, we have that. And understanding that your licensing world's going to change. Probably from this level down, it's all going to be GPL. And you should be happy to be using GPL there, and you should be expecting to provide all the obligations there. Probably in the middle level here, you're going to find different licenses, maybe a mixture of copyleft and attribution. Then up in your application is going to be all commercial, all your stuff, plus the open source that you bring in. And probably if you're a commercial organization, you might trend more toward the permissive licenses versus the copyleft licenses. But understanding this thing, especially if you're in IoT or automotive, you're going to have a much more complicated system. But as I see financial services talk more about containers, that's basically, as somebody said, containers are Linux. Basically, the heart of the containers is a lot of the GPL license code. And what I see developers doing more and more is just saying, oh, I'm going to treat it as a black box. I'm going to mix my code, your code, et cetera. And I think the GPL compliance is becoming even more important as we start to look at that distribution model there. And drawing out this box and the architecture diagram is very helpful. And don't neglect, especially with the GDPR and the other privacy issues, to think about where are you calling out through web services, REST APIs, et cetera, whether it's your own company or outside of the company. That's often overlooked as a third-party issue since it's not quite source code, but it's a place where your data, especially the PII, comes and goes. Okay. From a perspective of the ownership, I think sometimes you'll see the stacks have different owners. IT traditionally manage your infrastructure. Maybe not development oriented, not legal license oriented, et cetera. It's really about nuts and bolts of keeping the devices on or the cloud services up. Your development team really understands the product that you build, kind of that executable that then runs on this IT infrastructure. And they have different management cycles. They have different understanding of the legalities. IT might just be thinking about vulnerabilities and payments. Your team is going to be thinking maybe about open source licenses and vulnerabilities, but from a different perspective. And if we go back to here, the IT team might think maybe this layer down. Your development team thinks maybe this layer up. But if you only listen to half of that conversation, you're going to hear, oh yeah, we're doing all the patching. Well, maybe they're doing the patching down here at the Linux kernel and whatnot, but they're neglecting all the patching up here and vice versa. And I think this is how companies are finding themselves in trouble because their patch management world and their IT vulnerability management world doesn't cross the development side and the IT infrastructure side. So
that's an interesting one. Steve here. Steve and I are from the Open Compute Foundation, so this is open source hardware, like servers and switches and storage devices, and it's getting even messier, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because the people who look after the physical stuff are also concerned about licensing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
For the reason as we saw the problem.
Yep. And I think we're starting to see concern about supply chain attacks, both hardware and software. There's a little out of scope of this as well, but I think part of this is an IT asset problem. What open source libraries are we using? What physical resources are we using? Where did they come from? Who touched them along the way? And I think especially in the financial services organizations, the protection of the entire supply chain, from physical devices to software, IT infrastructure to source code itself, is going to be extremely important. So let's, I'm going to pass across some of these Linux areas here, but think about this around the container world. There's certain things, if you're using it, it was mentioned in the back before, about there's certain organizations and people who are doing a lot of enforcement. They expect their code to be open. They expect you as a large billion-dollar organization with many lawyers to understand what the obligations are and why aren't you doing it. So things like, if you're using a Linux kernel and you're shipping it, or you're shipping BusyBox, which is a component out there, the IP tables, IP chains, others, the expectation is you should know what you're doing. And these are the kind of proof points when people are looking at Linux and containers and saying, is this organization doing the right compliance? They'll go check and say, are they even telling me that they're using the Linux kernel? Are they even telling me that they're using BusyBox? And if not, I don't have to do it. My job's done. They're not complying, and therefore I'm going to send them a note or a nastygram. And also, these are good tests for you internally. Where are we shipping Linux? Where are we shipping containers? Are we even thinking about compliance documents, et cetera? And we haven't even talked about the vulnerability management very well. So let me just skip that. So let's talk about the places where we get started. So there's a lot of technical debt. We can't boil the ocean. I think a lot of people get to this place where they get analysis paralysis, where if I can't do it all, we can't even get started. So I'm going to recommend some places where to get started here. So you go back to your organization and you say, let's start thinking about, especially in the financial services world, where can we get started? Where can we get some quick wins in terms of compliance and security? So first off, if we're using Linux anywhere, if we're shipping Linux, if we're building terminals and we're distributing it to our partners, we should really have a good plan around Linux compliance, at least the baby steps around that. If we're shipping physical devices, if we're shipping virtual machines, if we're shipping containers, let's start that discussion about what does GPL compliance look like for us in the financial services world. Cryptographic components. The classic here is OpenSSL. Recently, about a month ago, there was the libSSH vulnerability that came out as well. This happens all the time. It's not that they're bad components. It's just that everybody knows that they're the underpinnings of the financial services world and the internet. So if I attack crypto, I can get in. And I know that it's ubiquitous. I know it's everywhere there. So start there. What versions of OpenSSL we're using? libSSH, OpenSSH, whatever we're using. Let's figure it out. And odds are you're going to have multiple copies in a single application. OpenSSL, I typically see 4, 5, 6, 7 different versions from different supply chains that are coming into your single application. So don't stop at the first one. Figure out where all your versions are coming from. And also use that as a little bit of a weapon for your vendors to have them get their act together. You're going to find that you're getting a lot of old crypto from both your open source vendors and your commercial vendors that they haven't updated in 5 years since the Heartbleed attack came out. So use that as a great test, and also just helps you put them on notice that you're paying attention to these things. Compression components, so zlib and others, are often have some security issues. They're also just very visible. So if I come in and I look and I say, oh, let's go see where good old zlib is. It's like the classic proof point. It's kind of like vanilla. It's everywhere. We're going to see it everywhere. Expect it's there. What's the version? Do we have the license? And if it's not there, again, it's a great bellwether test to say they're not following anything. And it also has some known vulnerabilities. So if I find the older versions, it's a great way to say if they're not even fixing the zlib vulnerability, they haven't been keeping track of anything else. Multimedia components, so if you're slinging audio or video, we start to see this now more where people saying, push the button to talk to somebody on demand, or I'm going to play some video, things like that. Again, very, very targeted, have some known vulnerabilities, also might have some patent and IP issues out there. And then the application platforms. So if you're on Java, you're probably targeting Tomcat. You're probably targeting something like JBoss. If I'm on NPM, I have the NPM system. Again, great test. If we haven't even applied with the heart of our system, we're not complying anywhere else. And this is a great way to get some quick hits in terms of security from both your internal teams and your vendors. If our version of Tomcat is 2 years old, we probably have some security issues. And there's reasons why some of these things don't get updated. It's because there's sometimes compatibility issues. They fixed the bug, but by fixing the bug, I have to update to 2 versions newer, and it breaks all my old legacy code, and so I can't do that. And so there's this trade-off of rework for fixing compatibility issues versus closing up security holes. And I think very often this becomes the engineering debate. And so sometimes we need to come in and put some more pressure on there to say, yes, we need more time in the roadmap to deal with these things. It can't be all new features all the time. Sometimes we have to do strengthen and make our infrastructure more resilient. The last one here is databases. This is a great test. When I talk to somebody who says, do you use open source? No. Well, what's your database? Oh, we're using MySQL. It's a great test that kind of helps you understand what's their knowledge of open source and licensing. And it's one of the first questions I'll ask when I'm kind of testing a team to see where they're at. Databases have a lot of strong licensing. We've seen the AGPL with the MongoDB. We've seen that with some of the new license changes with like Redis and some of the NoSQL databases. I wouldn't expect over the next year or so to see, I'd expect a lot more changes out there. So people are looking for business models, and they see, especially financial services, saying, hey, we use a lot of this, therefore it's a good proof point. It's also another way to know what are kind of the extents of your system. So where's your system running? Oh, we have a database over here, we have a queue over here, we have an identity system over here. You're going to find that your system is a lot more complicated than just a classic application running on a single device. Okay. So I have a great list of questions here that I find very eye-opening. I have these printed out also later if people are interested. I have a version of this. But it's some great questions to kind of start the conversation. Do we have a list of open source? Do we have a bill of materials? Go look at it. If it's a couple dozen items, add 2 zeros to your total content there. If they can't produce that list within an hour, there isn't a list, is my general rule. And how deep have we looked and how complete is it? Sometimes people will run a tool and say, oh, here's our list. But they just ran it an hour ago. They've never run it before. They've never been self-reflective on this list and the licenses and the vulnerabilities. So how complete is it? Did you just build it because I asked for it, or do we keep this as part of our engineering practices? As I talked about before, crypto, compression, multimedia, look for those. Those are the hot button issues. Go look at the version of OpenSSL you're using. How many years old is it? That's a great sign. If it hasn't been updated in years, nothing else has been updated. Ask pointed questions about repository managers. Everybody should know what repository managers they're using and where. Maven, NPM, NuGet, these are the classic ones. We can talk more about that later. But these pull in code, and you will not see that code, you'll not see that open source code in your source code management system. You'll see references to it, and you'll see the configuration files, but that code does not get pulled down until build time. And that's a very common compliance problem. Somebody will take the source code system, they'll run a grep, they'll run a license scanner tool, and they'll miss all the stuff that's actually there at build time. So strong recommendation to look both at your input and your output and kind of pay attention to what's being brought in by the repository managers. Web services, including things like credit card processors, GIS and geographic lookups, these are things that often get overlooked. And they sometimes they work in development because you're making 20 calls a day, 250 calls a day, but then you push something to production, 1 million calls a day, to some service that had no clue that you were going to be calling onto it. It can lead to a problem. It's also a place where your data is leaving. Databases, virtual machines, component containers, that full stack is very important. We showed it before. And then lastly, do we have a disclosure list from our commercial vendors? And you have an excellent opportunity whenever you buy software from somebody, whenever it's time for contract renewal time, or even just in general, perfect time to go to your vendor and say, I'm doing all this. Where's your equivalent? What's this culture? If you're not familiar with the OpenStack organization, it's very important to kind of get that culture of, OpenChain, the culture of software supply chain working for you. So ask them for their disclosure list. What open source are you giving to me? What commercial code are you giving to me? I'm seeing an interesting kind of philosophical debate here, and I fall on one side, which is tell me all the open source and all the commercial code you're using. I want to know that you're tracking your inventory. I want to know that you're tracking the vulnerabilities and licenses. Even if you're not legally comply to give me that disclosure list. I want to know. I want to know what you're using. I want to know what your dependencies are, and I also want to give you the internal pressure so that you can build your systems. You know, with the pressure from your clients, people get better, and it also allows you, when you're trying to defend why you're building security lists and bill of materials, you're able to point and say, well, our vendors are expecting this now, and it's good for you as well as a vendor. Get that into your contract if you can, and you might have that already. You might say you're going to give us a list of all the open source. You're going to give us a list of all the commercial clients.
We need to register those licenses in the CMDB if we're using it.
Yep. I think that's an internal policy question. I'm a general believer of if I have open source licenses and I then end up shipping it, I should probably be registering. You know, it's as if I picked it. That's my philosophy. If you're not doing a distribution, I think that's going to be about a classic question for your internal policy tracking. I like keeping track of everything, so when the struts comes out, I know where I'm using it.
If we are only using open source, we're not modifying code or distributing it, what are our obligations?
Sure. So let me, I'll get right to that, because that's the perfect segue for this. So I'm going to maybe, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip some of these commercial compliance issues, and we'll get right to that the SaaS question here. But in general, this is what we talked about here. The buck stops with you. If you get code and you ship it, you're responsible for everything you ship. If you're able to kind of almost outsource correctly the compliance and security tasks to your vendor, put the pressure on them. What happens too many times is you get a phone call that says, I need to know all the open source that you're using right now, and if your supply chain hasn't passed this on to you, you end up having to do an audit for them. So have your commercial companies provide you this list of disclosures and whatnot, so then you can just pass it on, as your earlier question, onto your end users and also to your security team and things like that. One recommendation I'd have here is use those kind of the dirty dozen of components. You know, how many OpenSSLs can you find? How many zlibs? How many Tomcats? And use that as pressure back on your supply chain, saying, hey, I ran a scan or I did a quick visual inspection, and your Tomcat's 2 years old, your OpenSSL's 9 months old, and so on and so on. Unacceptable. You know, I want you to do better. So then they will, the next cycle through, hopefully do a better job for you. Let me skip this here, and let's just get to the kind of commercial components and then the kind of SaaS issues here. So your commercial code that you're getting might be in binary form. So it may be very difficult for you to deal with it. And my general advice is you probably should not be trying to reverse engineer and do a deep dive on your kind of supplier code outside of the trying to find those bellwether things to kind of point and say you need to do a better job. You may be forced to. You know, you might be getting a compliance letter or a customer obligation that says in a week we need this to close the sale. But in general, try to push that out. Set that contractual standard for the disclosure levels. And if you're getting Linux, both for internal use and external use, I see a lot of time that there's this, we'll see the words all, you know, in a lot of contract terms, disclose all open source, disclose all licenses, and you're shipping a copy of Linux. That can be very, very, very difficult to comply with. And this also leads to sometimes this like arguments about, well, if we can't do it, should we be doing it at all? Or, well, if we can't do it for Linux, then we don't have to do it for our own products. So I think it's important to kind of understand what this whatever language that you are under effect, and also what you're putting your vendors in. So if something says all, try to do, you know, obviously as best as you can, but as you can, try to select a vendor for Linux or whatnot that can pass that on to you. You know, if the Linux vendor's having difficulty doing compliance for the operating system, you're probably not going to do any better than the people who are the experts in their operating system. So let's talk about SaaS now. So what's different about SaaS? So traditionally, if we distributed code, the license obligations came into effect. If we're on SaaS, we're not actually doing a distribution, well, do we need to track it? From a license perspective, a lot of people 5 years ago were saying, hallelujah, we don't have to worry about compliance anymore outside of certain things. It's just put it in, you know, ship it, or don't ship it, put it out on the web, and we're good. That was very license oriented. I think what Heartbleed and then the Struts 2 vulnerability showed us is if we don't have a bill of materials, we don't know what vulnerabilities are going to affect us, and the time scales involved in us trying to figure out, do we have Struts, do we have OpenSSL? those timescales are too short for us to be able to discover it and put a remediation in place before kind of the outside scripts are able to discover it before us. So my general philosophy is we should be having a bill of materials for anything we're using primarily for security purposes, but also because business models change. So what's SaaS today is an on-premises distribution for your biggest customer tomorrow, or somebody wraps it in a container for a private cloud and passes it on. And all the choices that people made because they said, oh, we don't have to worry about it because we're never shipping it, come and bite you later on. So keep that in mind. Maybe sometimes think about that you may always be doing a distribution in the future, and make a choice based on perhaps future compliance versus current compliance. Be aware of the FINOS GPL. That is the main license that is probably going to, people are going to be asking you about in terms of your SaaS compliance. And that FINOS GPL is basically a license that says if you're providing a network service and you're doing certain things behind the scenes, you might be required to provide source code to your users. In a little bit, I'll talk about where that comes into play. Let me skip this here. So talk about the AGPL. Term you might hear is the ASP loophole, which is when people talk about the AGPL. And what that meant is, hey, if we're not distributing code, we don't need to do any open source compliance. The open source world said, wait a second, that's not the philosophy of open source. And so they created the AGPL as one of the first kind of licenses to say, you know what, we think you should be providing source code and attribution to your products. So the idea was to close that loophole for people who are doing SaaS vendors. There's some libraries that you're probably going to come across that are AGPL licensed. iText is probably the one that's most common for people. MongoDB is also extremely common in financial services. So iText is for generating PDFs. MongoDB is basically a database. A couple of the others, BerkeleyDB, Funable, GhostScript, Neo4j, Magento. These are fairly common libraries in certain areas. But you'll notice that many of them are dual licensed. So people are using this strong copyleft license kind of as a carrot and stick for a business model. So if you're in the pure open source, we can just use it under the AGPL. Most people in the room are probably using it for commercial purposes. They don't want to perhaps be under the effect of this AGPL or potential AGPL. So purchase a commercial license and just treat it like a commercially licensed library. That is, I think that's been the culture of AGPL recently. It's been a dual license culture as opposed to a pure philosophical AGPL culture of giving you no other options. I don't know if that's going to change or not, but we're starting to see, especially like I said before, the well-funded database companies and things like that who are looking for a business model change or they're trying to get more revenue are definitely starting to look at license changes, especially around making this more of a strong carrot and stick to get people to pay. Okay, so what are some of the top concerns for SaaS compliance? So number one is the library vulnerability problem, kind of the struts 2 issue right now. That is where I think you're going to get the most support internally when you're starting to say, I need to start paying attention to open source licensing, I need to start paying attention to open source vulnerabilities. That idea of we're going to build a bill of materials, and the purpose there is so we can track vulnerabilities. What's a great side effect is we know everything we're using, we know the licenses, and we can start paying attention to things that may or may not be acceptable for our compliance purposes. Pay attention to AGPL. The reason why I think a lot of people get concerned about this is, first off, it's because of this dual licensing. There's commercial companies behind it who want their license revenue. But also your clients are going to be asking. So if they're going to ask you about any open source issue in the SaaS world, it's going to be around AGPL. They're going to ask that explicit question, and you want an instant answer. We don't use AGPL, or we use this library, but we paid the commercial option for it, and it should be an instant response. There's a couple other licenses that are out there that are like the AGPL. So the Common Public Attribution license and the Open Software license. You don't see them very often. They're out there, so you should be aware of them. And if you're building policy, you should make sure you explicitly have that, because just one of those becomes a remediation problem if you're not going to be able to use it later on. And again, you might find a single library that's brought out there, but it's a reason to really have your engineers understand what your whitelist and your blacklist is for certain things. So what are some other things that people often say, oh, if we don't ship it, we don't have to worry about compliance. And I think that's kind of a very narrow view of it. If you're using a commercial database from well-known commercial companies and you're not shipping it, I think they still want their license revenue. So We should be commercial components, and commercial dependencies are obviously very important for us to understand what we're using. The components marked not for commercial use. They're not talking about distribution, they're talking about commercial use or not use, so you should really understand where that's being used. Restrictions on type of use, so no military use, none, in the US there's been certain things around people who are working with the immigration department, and there was earlier in the year there was a license that was changed that says if you're one of these companies, you're not allowed to use this library anymore because you're working with the government on immigration issues. So be aware of that, especially if you're in a particularly sensitive area, military use, certain legal users, and so on and so on. Just understand that people might be writing licenses around you. The web attribution licenses. This is one of the more annoying ones, kind of like the vanity licenses. We often will see this. It says, if you use this JavaScript component, put a link on your homepage. And if you're a major financial organization, you're probably not going to put a link on your homepage to this one-off thing, but you're using it. And so it's important to understand those and kind of clean out kind of the compliance issues there. And yeah.
Just made me think of it, this list here.
Mm-hmm.
Where we've got sanctions against countries. Have
Yep.
you actually seen that coming into this sort of...
A couple of years ago, there was a license that was around the NATO. It was perceived as the NATO invasion of Serbia and Kosovo. So there was a license that said if you were a NATO country and your country was involved with Serbia and whatnot, you're not allowed to use this component.
I'm thinking more of so as a firm that we comply obviously with sanctions. So we have to ensure commercially you definitely can't work with countries that have got sanctions. So but then they could just open source it and you could go and work with them. So that surely that's going to have to come.
Yeah, so I've seen this with export control issues. So traditionally around crypto and export control is where that traditionally will come up. I have seen this some issues. It's usually a one-off where a library comes in and just for whatever reason somebody looks at the email address and it's coming from a certain country, and they go, wait a second. If it was a Gmail account, they wouldn't have probably been aware of it, but they saw that it was coming from a certain country that they're not allowed to work with. That was how they found it, but it was very ad hoc, and it was very dependent on people understanding what those restrictions are. But that's a great thing to tell your team. We don't want code from XYZ. Maybe do a search on email addresses and URLs and things like that, which is often a common way that people identify where code is coming from.
There's no real governance yet in the industry around
not that I've seen outside of export control. Automotive definitely has to pay attention to this because they're actually building devices that get shipped to countries, so you see that. And then perhaps in the US we have like some of these ITAR regulations in terms of like if you're doing aerospace and rocketry, you're going to have to pay attention to where your code comes from and goes as well. But those are very, very, I think, very specific. Okay, and then components with unknown license terms. Pretty common. I was going to say about 10% of your code base, you don't currently have a license. Go look at it. The author never put out a license, so you don't quite know what those terms are. And probably half the time, if you go talk to the author and you say, "Can we have this under an MIT license or Apache 2.0 license?" they'll reply and say, "Of course you can." But A, it's not guaranteed. B, they might look and say, "Well, great. Look at whose email address is emailing me this. Maybe this is a perfect opportunity for commercial." Or maybe they're dead, maybe they're long gone, maybe they're not allowed to reply because you're now working for a competitor and vice versa. So again, do it right the first time, but also understand if you don't have a license, even in the SaaS world, that might be something that's a compliance concern for you. Okay. Other things, images, icons, sounds, fonts. These are things that people are very good at recognizing on the web. So they go, hey, those are the icons from Apple. Hey, those are the sounds from this game. Your developers maybe have done it as an Easter egg, or they didn't quite understand that these things have licenses just like your source code does. And people are really good at, you don't need a scanner to go, hey, that's the same sound as that XYZ game, or that's the the Gmail logo, et cetera. JavaScript and CSS. This is something where people can literally do a view source. And different companies have different policies about JavaScript. Is that seen as a distribution? Is it not seen as a distribution? Is it seen as a embarrassment issue? Things like that. So that's something we need to pay attention to. Do a view source. See what's going on. Patent licenses, probably less going to affect us here in the financial services term, but something we need to pay attention. And I've talked about the private installations, et cetera, a bunch of times. How are we doing on time?
The break is at 11:30.
Okay, great. Oh, so one more minute. Somebody. Great.
Jeff, I
Yes.
just wanted to
raise actually trademarks is also another
Yes.
area that is used in SaaS, so you really have to be careful.
Yes.
Some platforms prevent you from using them. You can't change it to keep the trademark.
Definitely, definitely. So I'll finish up here with kind of the remediation world. So you're going to do some scanning, you're going to do some discussions with your developers. You're going to find a whole bunch of stuff that you shouldn't be using. And this is where I see that paralysis comes in. People said, oh, they told us we should just build a bill of materials. Now we found stuff because of our technical debt. Now what do we do with it? Some of it's relatively straightforward. You know, you remove it and you rewrite it. That's the most common license fix that's out there. You know, so remove it, remove the feature. You know, fix it over the next couple of months, things like that. There's definitely some risks and drawbacks. First off, is you lose functionality and you lose time. But the contra story to that is you're using somebody else's code and breaking their license. The dirty room reimplementations we talked about before, it can be very, developers can be very enthusiastic about rewriting it, but is it really a rewrite? And the new code's license may be no better. I see so many people say, oh, we got rid of this because it's GPL, and they come back with a story for something that says not for commercial use. So when we remove something, it's really important that we pay attention to what the new license is, and are we actually fixing the problem? This is very common during merger and acquisitions, that people say, we got to fix this ASAP. Smaller companies being bought by a larger company who has like a real license policy, and they want the business to continue, so they got to fix this real quick.
Is that distribution as well? That's one thing we come up with.
I don't know if I think a change of control, I'm not a lawyer, I think change of control is not seen as a distribution,
okay.
But I think M&A is an excellent time to use the power of the M&A process to fix things internally, and you also are going to be perhaps seen as a bigger target when you buy something. Last two things here. So what else? Ask the author for a relicense. This is extremely common that people, you know, if it's big enough, you say, man, there's no other option out there. Can we ask for a relicense? So would you be willing to give this under an Apache 2.0 license? Could we pay you something for this? Maybe offer something. This is often done through an intermediary. Maybe you're outside legal, so it doesn't have your big trillion-dollar company's name associated with it. You know, I'm a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a lawyer, and I have a client who'd like to use this, but they would like to use it under Apache 2.0. Can they do that? Sure. You know, half the time they'll say sure. Certain things like Linux, you can't do that. You can't relicense Linux. You have to understand the culture. The author may now want a stronger license. Yeah, no GPL, Affero, or $1 million. And sometimes the license is longer than the code. You're using 15 lines of JavaScript, and you go reach out to the original author, and they say, great, here's this big license. Now you got to deal with that. I think it's required. It's part of the bookkeeping of doing this, but you need to pay attention. And then I don't like this, but this is what I think a lot of companies end up doing, which is they wait and see. They find that something's bad, and they let it sit there, and they see if a problem occurs, and then they deal with it after the fact. This is common for very old code, you know, code that's 20 years old. Hey, we haven't had a problem in 20 years, and for very risk-tolerant organizations. I think in some ways this is also probably very realistic. It's probably what's happening anyway. I don't like the wait-and-see attitude. I don't think it's legal. I don't think it's always appropriate. But it's also maybe reality. It's what's happening behind the scenes, even if we didn't discover it. So what are the risks? Copyright infringement, license problem if forced to comply. And then lastly, you can't properly disclose your open source licenses. It's there. Your customers can see it's there. You look in the about box and something's missing. And this is something where I think internally people find themselves sometimes under a lot of political pressure. You know, part of the organization is saying, hey, we can't fix it. The other part of the organization is saying, but we're not doing the right thing. And I think especially in well-regulated industries like finance and healthcare, this is becoming a bigger problem for people as they're aware of it. So it's the break now. So I want to thank everybody for kind of listening to me today. I'm available all day today if there's any follow-up or questions that people have. I'd love to talk about this. Feel free to email me, follow me on Twitter, let me know there. Those are all easy ways. And thanks so much. Appreciate it.